Hey everyone, and welcome to our live stream series that All Tech is Human does with our organization partner, The Bridge. We're always looking at some of the thorny issues in tech and society. And you know what? If there's a thorny issue, I would say that it's social media's role in the US election. I'm your host and moderator for today's discussion. I'm the founder of All Tech is Human. My name is David Ryan Polgar. You can find me on Twitter at Tech Ethicist, and also All Tech is Human at All Tech is Human. Pretty simple right there. I'd also like to thank Radical AI Podcast, which is going to be running this discussion with their podcast, and then include additional resources you can follow along with, including kind of related books and other resources to make these more action related. I'll also emphasize that we try to make this 45-minute discussion together highly interactive. So I'd love for you to insert your questions in the chat feature. I'll be looking at those, playing double duty, and inserting a lot of these into the stream. So I'm really excited about the two great guests that we have today. We have Veras Background and also Dipayan Ghosh. So Veras Background is the CEO of Rethink Global Strategies, the Senior Policy and Technology Advisor for the Institute for Security and Technology, and the former strategy and research at Twitter. So Vera, welcome to today's live stream.
Thank you for having me.
Also like to intro Dipayan. He's a co-director of the Digital Platforms and Democracy Project at the Harvard Kennedy School, the former public policy advisor at a little startup called Facebook, and also the author of Terms of Disservice. I'll try to put that on screen, and then the subtitle of that is How Silicon Valley is Destructive by Design. So, Dipayan, you are not bearing the lead on that. Welcome to today's discussion.
Thanks for having me, David, and it's a pleasure to have a chance to chat with you and Vera.
Well, we're really excited, as is Kate O'Neill, who we have joining us today too. She's doing some great work, and as a follow-up, she's got a great discussion with Yael Eisenstadt at 2:30 Eastern today. And just to give a little more context, since this is a very thorny, complicated topic, when we're really talking about social media's role in democracy at large, especially on November 3rd, we have this upcoming contentious US election that a lot of people are really concerned about, given that it's so contentious. But to give us a little bit of background for today's discussion, I'd like to have each one of you, and I'll start with Vera, to discuss a little bit more about your background and how it relates to today's discussion around social media's role in the US election. So Vera.
Yeah, so David, again, thank you for having me. It's just delightful to be here and chatting with you and Dipayan. So my background, actually, I spent many years working with policymakers on both sides of the aisle in Washington, and international policymakers as well as military leaders, looking at the role in global conflict, but most specifically the both where state and non-state actors, most especially terrorist organizations, use different modes of communication to persuade their audience and to target their audience, if you will, to achieve their desired objectives. I remember certainly for me, 9/11 was this kind of defining moment, and that's when I kind of really got into security, national security. And back then it was really a lot around terrorist organizations. And there was really very much in terms of how terrorist organizations and individuals were radicalizing people. Certainly YouTube, even back then in the day, and other channels as well. But then I think for me, when Ukraine happened, especially, and then really even earlier, but certainly Ukraine was sort of the hallmark of how Russia was using social media as well as offline as well, because it's part of a broader protracted malign influence campaign to target not just folks in Ukraine, but other parts of former Soviet Union and other parts of the world. That's kind of how I really got into the topic and really understanding this. And then after spending many years working with policymakers and military leaders, I transitioned to Silicon Valley world, really trying to understand how does social media work? What is the impact of technology on all of this? And to be frank, I mean, I think it's just kind of given me a little bit more of a nuanced perspective, because on one side you have the disinformation dilemma, which is huge in terms of, social media is definitely overall as an industry weaponized. information, and now that I'm sure we'll talk about this, sort of the filter bubbles that we live in, but then also this the flip side of disinformation, right? Which is, and I'll talk about this a little bit as well, which is digital authoritarianism, because on the other side you have actors like China and Iran that are using state-run propaganda and actually censoring their populations, not just within their own countries and globally. So again, thorny topic.
It is a thorny topic.
But one, when we discuss regulations and other things that we can do about, I feel both sides should be considered.
Well, Vera, thank you for that overview. It seems very quaint to think that we used to consider social media or the internet at large as cat videos, but somehow we've gone in 2020 from cat videos to QAnon. So maybe a good title for a book, Dipayan, if you are working on a sequel. So I'll move over to you, Dipayan. Tell us a little bit more about your background. I know you have some extensive work in government, and also curious with some of your work at Harvard Kennedy School.
Thanks so much, David. And it's this is obviously a fascinating set of topics and a really high-powered group of folks to speak with. Very briefly, I think my deep concern with the shape of the media ecosystem as it stands today was really driven by the year of 2016 as a general matter. I was working at Facebook at the time and was really witnessing a set of circumstances, a commercial infrastructure, if you will, that marketers, including political campaigns and disinformation operators, were essentially taking advantage of, and really starting to damage democratic process in serious ways, in my personal view. And that's what drove me to write this book, Terms of Disservice, and lead this research project at Harvard, where we try to study the business models behind companies, behind Silicon Valley internet platforms, to be more specific, and their connection with society. And in fact, this is what in a new paper by Nick Coldry and me. Nick is a professor at LSE on media and communications that we released yesterday. We try to make a new kind of connection between the business model and the impact not only on economics and politics, which a lot of people have discussed, but on society itself. And I think we're seeing this again now in the context of this election. Yesterday's hearings in Washington are a good illustration of how noisy the media environment has become. This is nominally a hearing about Section 230 reform, and no one talked about Section 230 reform, except for Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg, as a matter of fact. So I think we all need to come to terms with how everything is changing around us, and we need to figure out a way to put power back in the hands of consumers and rebalance the distribution of economic power from these dominant platforms in Silicon Valley back to the little guys.
So I'll use that to springboard for our first question, which is really the title for today's discussion about social media's role in the U.S. election. Vera, start with you. What do you generally see as social media's role? Because as Dipayan is talking about, how do we shift the power back to the individuals? But I think it's a interesting discussion about what role social media platforms should play. For example, if they are intertwined with democracy, that is handing a significant amount of power to unelected officials. So how would we change that? Or is it about kind of altering the power dynamic? So Vera, what are your general thoughts on where you see social media's role in democracy at large, and specifically with this upcoming US election?
Yeah, so let me kind of start also just the broader societal, which is democracy at large. And again, there's two sides of the coin that I do want to paint. When we saw sort of the rise, if you will, of social media, to me, the anchor is the Arab Spring. And, when we saw these massive protests and all the changes and the reforms that led in the Middle East, right? Now we see similar things happening. I mean, I'm just saying the one finger on the positive. We see. I mean, I personally haven't followed, democracy, sort of this field for a while, Hong Kong, but certainly day in and day out, to this day, we see protests from, certainly on Twitter, from Belarus, right? They're trying to oust Lukashenko. So there's that. So the ability to, for one side of social media, is to inform the public, to share information, to inform the public, and even for this election specifically, in a positive way, to mobilize the population, to galvanize it, to mobilize, to also get out to vote. I think what we've seen on the positive end, there is, certainly Facebook and Twitter, Google as well. They have pretty massive, voter centers and information centers, been having this kind of like registering to vote, all of that. So that's all positive, and that's great. So like my point is, there's a lot of service, right? Just the way the information travels that social media provides. But to Depian's point, with that comes the bad stuff as well. And it's not only what concerns me, particularly social media's role in the U.S. election writ large. It's not only the sort of the tone of the conversation and how disinformation, the virality of disinformation, and how it spreads in open networks, but also closed networks as well. So like I'm thinking, for example, in Facebook groups, right? A lot of stuff what we think about right now with, QAnon, with Proud Boys, a lot of the domestic terrorism that we're dealing with right now, sort of other things as well that are out there. And even let's just talk about the infodemic, right? There's the whole anti-vax movement. A lot of it, yes, you're going to see this, and based on sort of micro-targeting and political ads that you may or may not see, or other ads, sort of advocacy ads, you're going to be targeted in certain ways, and they're going through those filter bubbles. But I'm also concerned, as part of it, is again more of this kind of the closed networks, or if you will, groups that may not be necessarily, everyone is not going to be in those groups. Right. So it's one of those things, again, the thorny issue, because we have to, in proposing any kind of meaningful reforms, I think we need to recognize sort of all of these positive, attributions that are actually really necessary for democracy to thrive, but also then how do we actually go after, and engage and handle some of the negative repercussions. Disinformation is certainly one of them. And then the other issue, which we may touch on, is privacy, right? Privacy, yes. And then the ability to actually, whether our information is consumer information is going to the wrong hands.
Okay. And I guess the question that I would send over to Depian, given everything that you're talking about, one, since you mentioned disinformation, I will say to everybody watching, happy Media Literacy Week. Media literacy is essential to a thriving democracy, which feels somewhat in peril right now. So let's put a more emphasis on media literacy. But Depian, you worked previously with Facebook. We call these social media companies. I'll put an emphasis on the latter, media. However, they're not obviously legally considered a media company, which is part of the discussion around Section 230. But it seemed like with yesterday's heated kind of whatever you want to call that food fight, there always seems to be kind of a circling around with speech online, and really kind of viewing a lot of these major social media platforms as if they are media companies. And what I will say, the key difference that sometimes we forget is that a media company filters and then publishes, whereas the way we traditionally set up the internet and then the web and then social media companies is that you basically are having individuals publish, and then the platform has the right but not responsibility to filter the kind of ecosystem that they have. Where do you see that kind of changing, especially given your expertise around business models? Because there's always a lot of debate around whether we should consider social media companies and classify them as media companies.
It's a great thought, David. And to put it a bit from a different sort of angle, you could see it almost as a spectrum. On one side, you have companies that are like platforms, or on one side you have platforms that really just serve as a conduit for information. like let's say your internet provider. And on the other side, you have media organizations that essentially serve to write and publish and curate content, like the New York Times or Fox News. I would suggest that, the funny thing is that Facebook sometimes claims that it's a platform in certain situations when it serves Facebook's commercial interest, and in other situations claims that it's a media organization. Or to be more specific about the way that Facebook characterizes its presence or its economic value, Facebook sometimes tries to put around the idea that there is intellectual property in the way that it curates content, and that serves as a meaningful force in our economy. The key here is that whether you're under one regulatory structure or the other, you stand to gain some benefit from protection from the law, but you also stand to be under some regulation under the law. That's to say, have some constraints applied by the law. And because Facebook hasn't technically been classified under either, it plays its position around the spectrum in convenient ways so that it can take advantage of the positive aspects of being considered a platform, in the sense that it can take advantage of Section 230, for instance, or takes advantage of being able to be considered a media organization of sorts. It doesn't explicitly call itself a media organization, but it claims that its curation of content helps consumers. I think to be honest, it does serve both functions in different ways. And if it wants to benefit from the protections, the legal protections that it gets from one or the other status, it should also be subject to stringent regulations under one or the other. So my personal view is very much in line with yours, David, and I think the frustrating thing is that, many people, including in Congress, it takes a long time to get here. It took a long time for us to get to the point where we're starting to say that, Section 230 may not be so sanctified. Maybe we do need to reform it. Maybe we do need to put some carve-outs on Section 230. If you think about this, a year ago, you had politicians from both sides saying that that is the internet. We don't want to touch the internet ever. And that goes with the expert community too. But now it's become the popular thing to say. That's not a bad thing. The Overton window shifts, but I think if we really can look at the economics of these companies now, as it stands, we could have said this a long time ago. We should have been having these conversations a while back. To something that Vera just said earlier as well. I think she's absolutely right. Social media's place in our national discourse, political discourse, is defined by the Arab Spring. Should be defined by the Arab Spring, normatively at least. Here you had a situation where Facebook and Twitter were responsible for alleviating the intellectual oppression of tens of millions of people in an important region of the world. And it was largely Facebook and Twitter, or at least the convening power that organizers were able to establish over Facebook and Twitter, that enabled them to speak with each other and break out of that mold. But in the 2 or 3 years after that, Facebook started integrating advertising technology and algorithms into ad optimization and content creation, which has led to the disinformation problem and the problems around hate speech that we have seen in 2016 and see today. So the platforms are different from what they were 10 years ago. And I think to an extent, we do either need to return in some way to the circumstances in 2010, or rethink the media regulatory environment so that we can reshape ourselves and start to work against the virality of these various offending forms of content.
Do you think we should pay for Facebook? I remember there was an op-ed, this was a couple of years ago, that argued, Mr. Zuckerberg, let me pay for Facebook. Title was, something around that. And obviously, we know that Silicon Valley has really kind of honed into this free but not free type of idea, quote unquote, attention economy based on an ad-based platform. So Vera, I'd love to hear if you have any kind of thoughts on that, because there's always been discussion, especially from a lot of advocacy groups, to say, well, let us actually pay for that. On the flip side, people have argued that there would be a massive distinction about then who pays for it, who has the free product, and then maybe treating privacy as a luxury as opposed to a right. So what are your thoughts specifically on that?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think there's two things. One is, paying. If we view these platforms as, if you will, public square, where conversation happens, we're there to inform, to get information, to mobilize, to social, and also to form a community. Paying for it, it's interesting. It's an interesting concept. I'm not 100% sure that's the right way to go, because the one thing that I'm concerned about is potential inequality. Okay. Because who's going to pay? There's folks that, like, for example, that can afford to pay and will pay, but then if you think about this broad segment of the population that use it to, in a very benign way, to connect with family and friends, to read up on sports on news and whatever, cannot. And then also, again, back to the point of, if we go back to the original principles, right? A free, not just free expression, to what Deepan was saying. We're talking about Arab Spring. I can talk about Hong Kong. I can talk about Belarus. In the U.S., Black Lives Matter. Like all of these kind of movements, wherever they are, and the ability in the ability for those movements to actually galvanize and organize. If we use these platforms, does that actually discourage, reduce those movements from happening, or discourage the participation in those movements? That's just one thing that I add. But to your point, also, there's the flip side of it, which is the advertising, to exactly what Deepan said, advertising. And in this election, we can certainly talk about it, the political advertising around certainly U.S. election and also other elections, which not only leads to micro-targeting, but actually spreads disinformation and really, really confuses voters.
Okay, let's shift over and talk about the New York Post. I will admit that sometimes that is a guilty pleasure of mine when I'm walking around Manhattan. I buy it for its punny headlines, but Deepan, a lot of discussion around the recent New York Post story detailing the kind of alleged emails from Hunter Biden, a very convoluted story dealing with a computer shop in Delaware. A lot of platforms came down hard on this, wearing that it was potential misinformation or disinformation.
As they should.
Yeah. Well, so please expand on that and tell us what you think some of the thought process was, because I know there was a distinction between how Facebook originally approached it and then how Twitter did. And then even within Twitter, there was a debate from Jack Dorsey criticizing his own kind of trust and safety team, since they had blocked it from direct messaging at first to share the URL.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's a situation where the story seems to be a very clear instance of disinformation. Why do I say that? I say that because the substance of the story itself, or I hesitate to call it substance, the story itself, the narrative in the story itself, has similarities, alignments with Russian disinformation tropes from over the summer. That's part one. Part two, there are testimonies from Democrats and Republicans from, I believe, last month about this issue. Three, the intelligence community dozens in the intelligence community have suggested quite strongly that this is disinformation. I mean, what else do you need to really say assertively that, well, this is 95% likely to be disinformation. We're going to have to contain it from spreading, and particularly because it's it's a vicious story, vicious narrative. Let's say it is very likely untrue. It's very likely connected to foreign election interference. And it's timed at a moment in our national political discourse and during an election that could really be damaging to the democratic process. So I think it's right to take swift action against the content. Now, some of the I think the way that these actions get ironed out in the context of a Twitter or a Facebook as it's happening. These companies don't always have, under every circumstance, a plan in place, and I think that's understandable from my perspective personally. And what I would like to see at the end of the day are just good intentions. And I'm not saying that Jack Dorsey or Mark Zuckerberg or Sundar Pichai always have the best intentions, as a matter of fact. In fact, I would say that there are times when Facebook, for instance, has put its profits over the democratic interest quite explicitly, and I take great issue with that. But I think in Jack Dorsey's comments in response to, I think and Vera could speak much more effectively than me, given she worked at Twitter. But I think what came across is that his intentions are good. That came across yesterday, by the way, as well. I really appreciated his comments during the hearings yesterday, and that he would try to do his best to put in place a process going forward to contain the disinformation problem to the extent that Twitter should and can.
But Dipayan, do you think there's a lot of confusion right now? I certainly see it on my end. With the First Amendment and even how it applies, because a lot of people, when they discuss this type of issue, they like to say that Facebook or Twitter or other social media platforms are kind of offending their freedom of speech. Whereas if you actually dig out the Constitution, it's referring to what the government cannot do. That said, sometimes we do treat things in quasi public square types of mentalities, like we would a mall, since it is a private area, but has the expectation of a public gathering spot. So do you see anything kind of changing with that? Are we going to kind of have to change our conception even of how we think of free speech? Because, I mean, technically, it's the business under US law that would have a First Amendment speech. So really, Twitter and Facebook actually are extending their own free speech rights with moderation. So it seems to be a little bit of confusion in the public right now.
Yeah, I'll briefly say that I think it's a great point, David, and we do need to, in my opinion, we do need to rethink free speech. We do need to reform Section 230. We do need to, because of the public nature of dominant platforms in the political discourse, and those platforms' connection with society, democracy, elections, we do need to set some standards in place. That's my personal view, and I know that it's only a personal view and a political view, and it falls somewhere on a spectrum, and other people will fall in other places on that spectrum, understandably. But I think that we do need to start to rethink this, at least in the specific context of social media. What do we do about hate speech? What do we do about child exploitation? What do we do about because the problem is that this technological infrastructure is different from what humans are biologically and socially used to. And this new sort of algorithmic virality that can actually have very difficult consequences, terrible consequences on humanity.
Okay. So I'd like to right now incorporate a lot of the questions. We received a lot of questions beforehand as people were signing up. I'd also like to encourage anybody watching. You can also use our comment feature, and I'll see some of the additional comments that we should insert into the stream. But one of the questions really dealt with how does this issue, and I'll give this to Vera, how does this issue affect people who are actually not actively using social media platforms? For example, there's always been a movement for the last couple of years of the hashtag delete Facebook. So a lot of people like to basically say, hey, if this is a problem for you, then get off of these social media platforms. There's obviously a very popular Netflix movie, The Social Dilemma, which points out some of these major issues. So Vera, how would you answer that question? How does this impact people who are actually not even utilizing most of these major social media platforms?
It's huge, in fact. And I think the online and offline world correlates. And I think one thing that we forget sometimes, that disinformation and the ability to actually cause harm as a result of disinformation. We've already seen plenty of cases around this. And I'm certain that's like the one thing that I'm personally really worried around this election. It happens. But the key thing is disinformation happens. There's a couple of things. One is online. This is the social media, right? And then on social media, we go to our trusted sources. You're more likely to click on something. You're more likely to reshare, whatever, whatnot, if it's coming from people that you know and you trust. But then imagine for the people who are not offline. So the first thing is your first nuclear bubble where you're going to kind of consume the information is those trusted sources of friends and family. You, David, can go to your parents, or to your sister, brother, whomever, and be like, oh my God, guess what I saw? I know you're not on Facebook. I know you're not on Twitter. I know you're not on, following this YouTube channel, but can you believe this, right? And then someone goes, oh, and again, it spreads that way. And that is really, really powerful. The other piece of it, so like you cannot underestimate the friends and family. Then there's a third piece of it. And that is, let's not forget in this election cycle, what we're seeing is the real power of mainstream media and how polarized and politicized mainstream media has become. Yes, of course, you have journalists or pseudo-journalists, I would say pundits and influencers who are sharing this on social media, but they're sharing this on they're streaming this, they're sharing this on TV, they're going to other sources. And depending on your demographic, not everyone is on social media. My mama certainly is not, and so you have other channels that they're going to, and that's where they're going to get sort of their news and sources of information, and a lot, depends on where it's coming from. Some of it is going to be propaganda and disinformation. And then the fourth piece to it, tied, especially for those that are not tied to social media, and I think that also has an impact to kind of cultural, religious communities, socioeconomic, whatever your ethnic communities, whatever your affiliation may be. Here in the United States, we've seen this all the time, and also around the world as I've followed this issue. And that is sort of this whole concept of culture and society. Think about how this information gets spread through your churches, mosques, and synagogues, right? Through cultural institutions, through camps, all these other sort of affiliated things. Then again, someone may see something on social media. There may be a whole group of people that may not even be on social media. But the idea here is it's not this whole problem. It's social media has the virality without a question. It has been, the information has been weaponized. I think the political ads, right? The micro targeting, all of those things. But I think we cannot forget those other vectors of it. And I think in this election they become actually pretty severe, if you will, and that's something that I'm concerned about.
So, Dipayan, the question I'll ask to you is: Vera mentioned the power in 2020 of major media companies, these gatekeepers. However, the promise of social media, or even just the web at large, was to get away with the traditional gatekeepers and democratize information. However, in 2020, we've gone from the promise of the quote unquote information highway, nobody talks about it anymore, to now the infodemic. But the question I'll ask you, Dipayan, is are we seeing kind of a change now? Are these major gatekeepers coming back into play, or do you think that we're still on a pathway towards removing all of these major gatekeepers?
Well, I think it's a funny circumstance. Yes, I think Facebook, for instance, Twitter, YouTube would suggest that they are kind of taking away gatekeepers in the media ecosystem. We always see those YouTube videos where the hosts ask us to subscribe and like it, and we enjoy that, and we appreciate the fact that we're contributing to someone directly, instead of watching a Fox News or an MSNBC and contributing instead to their ratings as big media organizations in and of themselves. But at the end of the day, we have to recognize that it's not just that YouTube host that's capturing economic rent from our participation in watching their video. It's YouTube, and YouTube is becoming a gatekeeper. YouTube is a gatekeeper already. Every single sector of the consumer internet industry that we might look at and choose to analyze, whether it's social media or search or online video or internet-based text messaging, or e-commerce, or email, all of these sectors are monopolized by one of three companies. And when I say that, what I mean is that in each of those industries, it's one of three companies that has more than 50% market share, and in some cases more than 90% market share, or more than 85% market share. And that suggests that companies like Google through YouTube are becoming monopolies. And I would even suggest that they're not only monopolies, they're natural monopolies, and they're extracting economic rents at an exploitative rate. So I think they are becoming gatekeepers in the sense that you've got to accept those terms or go home.
Okay. Well, that leads to one of the questions we received from the audience before today's discussion. Vera, I'll ask you, but I imagine, Dipayan, you have a lot of thoughts on this as well. So what is actually going to need to happen in order for social media companies to change? Is this going to be regulation? Is this a some type of broader awakening of the conscious that needs to happen with some of these leaders, right? Do we allow for more self-regulation? I'm curious, Vera, to hear your thoughts. What needs to happen for social media to change?
Yeah, so I think on this is where I kind of feel like after thinking about this quite a bit, and thinking again also not just from social media and tech, but also democracy, civil society, national security lens. That's my framing for this. I think the first step before we just say, okay, I think we need to recognize, for example, Section 230, there's a lot of goodness in that. There's just maybe there needs to be some reforms to that, given sort of the realities that we're facing with. But I think the first step to this is pushing platforms in terms of responsibility for greater accountability and greater transparency, because and then also even auditability. So I don't know if this is the first step. Is it just full on regulation, or maybe it's some sort of like think about it, whether it's some sort of like a industry wide or board or commission or whatever that body looks like. I don't have the exact nonpartisan. But I think it's that first, that, and also passing the one thing I think we really actually need in this country. I mean, California is leading the way on this. In the U.S. is bigger privacy laws and privacy regulations, so our information is not shared. But the bigger thing is the transparency and this kind of auditability and action. So, but let me say this on this. Just what's also really important: the conversation can't just be with Congress and social media companies. The conversation also needs to include civil society. They're actually addressing these issues. They have diverse perspectives on these issues, and across a lot of these issues. I mean, pick whatever you can think. Gender, right? We can think about religion. I mean, all of it, right? Like all of it. That's one. And then the second piece, it has to include also international voices to incorporate geopolitical perspectives and geopolitical nuances. And I think that with civil society is mission critical in this broader transparency and accountability conversation that we have. Because, and let me just say, because again, let's remember, some of the bigger players that we're talking about, not the smaller ones, but bigger ones, and even the smaller ones too, as they're growing, they're international companies, right? They're multinational companies. They're operating under different laws in different countries. So I think, again, and context is super, super important here. So that's where civil society, that is where people who understand sort of the geopolitical and geostrategic nuances have to be part of those conversations.
Okay. And then Dipayan, I imagine your ears perked up when Vera said accountability and transparency. I know those are two major parts about terms of disservice. The question I like to ask, I saw you, a CNBC interview you did speaking about your previous role at Facebook, and then speaking about the company, you said, quote, privacy is directly in contradiction to its business model. So that presents a major kind of difficulty with making a shift. Where do you say we go from here?
I think you're absolutely hitting the right nail on the head, David. We need regulation. We have been through this time and time again. Facebook, Google. For the most part, those two companies, to be quite frank, have been pushing against movement on privacy around the world, not just in Washington, around the world, and throughout the United States, for that matter. So, I think what I'm trying to suggest here is that self-regulation is not going to work anymore.
Okay.
We've been with that system for 25 years. Essentially, the ad industry has if I had to characterize the way that it has tried to regulate itself, it is to stave off an actual regulatory threat from government time and time again, while maintaining the most exploitative parts of the business model behind the ad industry. I think that's not the kind of that's simply not the kind of regulation we need. Self-regulation.
Okay.
We need people working in the public interest. To Veras' point, people informed by a wide variety of voices from civil society. I don't really think, honestly, we need to listen to industry. To be quite frank, we know how the business model works. We know that, but I would say we need to listen to the public interest and act on the public interest.
Okay. Well, that's a great segue to our final question, and then we'll just kind of circle back and tell everybody where we can stay in touch with some of your great work that both of you are doing. The final question that we have from Fitz, how do we bridge the gap? And this goes to Vera, what you were talking about. How do we bridge the gap between elected government officials that have the ability to enact reform and individuals, groups that are already engaging with these issues? And frankly, I was thinking about that as well, right? So you have civil society that is very engaged in these issues once they get involved, but how do you actually bridge that gap between the government officials who have the power and ability to change and civil society, these groups that know what we should do or have suggestions of what we should do, but don't necessarily have a nice pathway into those elected officials? So Vera, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and then Dipayan, and then we'll wrap up here.
So 3 things. The last one I think is the most important. Inform, educate, and provide evidence. We can talk here and pontificate on a lot of this stuff. Dipayan, you were talking about the New York Post story with election interference, something I closely follow. Evidence. When you want to bridge, show the evidence. Show that also you can bring in those other diverse perspectives and diverse voices and bring the data behind it. Then I think you have elected government officials in Congress, executive branch, as well as around the world. Again, these companies are global. These issues are global, right? Mm-hmm. This is obviously, we're zeroed in on our election, a few days away. once we get the outcome and the country hopefully comes down, hopefully I put it in capital quotes, there's other elections around the world, right? There's other things. So again, so it's informed, educate, and evidence.
Okay. And then Dipayan, with yours, I'll also incorporate another comment that we had in case it dovetails into anything that you want to talk about. What can college students studying computer science do to learn how to create responsible technology? So just kind of with your final thoughts. So how can people get more involved, and how does this kind of relate to this movement? I know that we're trying to do it, All Tech is Human, to inform and inspire the next generation of responsible technologists and change makers.
Yeah, I think college students learning CS, and college students more generally, and younger people than that even, are the future. So I think how can all of you start to think about responsible technology? Well, I think there's a huge literature now that's coming together on how do we start thinking about responsible AI? How do we think about making sure that we're considering everyone's opinions? How can we make sure that artificial intelligence, when it's implemented in the news feed or in search engine results pages and page ranks, how can we make sure that it's not biased for the people in power, and that it's inclusive? Those are the kinds of questions we have to start thinking about. And I think, luckily, at most major universities in the U.S., for instance, there are data ethics classes now. There are ethical AI discussions that are happening as a matter of the core in computer science and electrical engineering. And I would say expose yourself to that. Yeah. Because as soon as you get exposed to that, you will open your mind to both the power of AI and its capacity to do good and potentially do bad, and that will help in your own analysis of the impact that you want to have on the world.
I love that.
If I can just add one thing to it,
yes.
It's fantastic, absolutely. And then in addition to computer science, learning to program, also maybe investigate going into design, right? And research. It's all about understanding the customers. It's all about understanding the people and bringing those diverse perspectives into the conversation, because that work informs how product is developed and how product is made, how policies are developed, how they are enforced, and how you can actually develop emerging technologies to serve democracy and society and actually counter some of it. There's a lot already that's on the table. I see a ton of startups that are already piping up left and right, but there's just so much more work to be done in this space.
Yeah. And I will say too that there's a big movement towards public interest technology in New America. Dipayan, you're associated with New America in the past, right? They run the Public Interest Technology University Network. And on a related note, All Tech is Human, we just released a free resource called The Guide to Responsible Tech: How to Get Involved and Build a Better Tech Future. You can find that, and it was released in partnership with NYU's Alliance for Public Interest Technology. You can find that at responsibletechguide.com. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in today and their great questions. We're also, since we couldn't get to all of them, we'll follow up in a message and include some of the other interesting kind of resources, a link to Dipayan's book, and other kind of resources that you can do to continue to build a better tech future. Again, I'm David Ryan Polgar with All Tech is Human. I'd also like to thank our organization partner, The Bridge. Check them out at thebridgework.com. And also a big thank you to our partner, Radical AI Podcast. Vera, I'd love to hear from you about where people can stay in touch with your incredible work.
Oh, thank you. It's been a fantastic conversation. So certainly you can find me at Twitter at VeraLaZA, or I have a website, Zachem Global, or at the Institute for Security and Technology. Terrific.
Dipayan, what about yourself?
Thank you, David. Thank you, Vera, as well, for the conversation. I'm on Twitter at GHOSHD7. That's the best way to keep in touch.
That sounds great. Again, terrific conversation. Vera, Dipayan, thank you for joining us today. And then everybody else with the All Tech is Human community, stay in touch at alltechishuman.org. Send us an email at hello@alltechishuman.org. Again, David Ryan Polgar, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you soon.